The crisp autumn leaves rustled under Officer Tom Chen's boots as he made his nightly patrol through Liberty Park. It was just past midnight, and the street lamps cast long shadows across the empty walkways. He'd been walking this beat for nearly 7 years, but something about tonight felt different. As he rounded the corner near the old oak tree, he spotted a familiar sight that had been catching his attention for the past few weeks: an elderly woman, probably in her mid-60s, sitting quietly on the same wooden bench. She wore several layers of clothing, clearly prepared for the dropping temperatures, and held what appeared to be an old photograph in her weathered hands. Tom had seen many homeless individuals during his years on the force, but something about this woman's demeanor set her apart. She didn't have the usual collection of bags and belongings that most homeless people carried. Instead, she had only a small backpack and always appeared clean and well-kept, despite sleeping in the park. "Ma'am," he called out gently, approaching with careful steps. "It's getting pretty cold tonight. Would you like me to call someone to help you find shelter?" The woman looked up, her eyes clear and alert, showing no signs of confusion or distress. "No thank you, officer," she replied with a slight accent that hinted at her Asian heritage. "I need to stay here." Tom noticed how she tucked the photograph into her coat pocket, her hands trembling slightly from the cold. "I've seen you here several nights in a row," he mentioned, keeping his voice friendly and conversational. "My name's Officer Chen. May I ask yours?" She hesitated for a moment before responding. "You can call me Mrs. Lei." Her voice carried a mixture of dignity and determination that caught Tom off guard. "Mrs. Lei, I'm concerned about your safety. We've had reports of coyotes in the park at night, and the temperature is supposed to drop below freezing." She smiled faintly. "I appreciate your concern, young man, but I have my reasons for being here." "I'm not causing any trouble, am I?" Tom shook his head. "No, ma'am, you're not. But as a police officer, it's my duty to ensure everyone's safety." He pulled out his flashlight, illuminating the area around them. The bench was clean, and he noticed she had placed a thin camping pad on it. Clearly, she came prepared for her nightly vigil. "Would you at least accept a cup of coffee?" Tom offered, remembering the thermos in his patrol car. "It might help with the cold." Mrs. Lei's expression softened slightly. "That's very kind of you, officer. Perhaps just this once." Tom walked back to his car, radioing into his partner, Officer Rodriguez. "Hey Dave, I'm checking on that woman again at Liberty Park. Going to offer her some coffee." "Copy that," Dave's voice crackled through the radio. "Want me to swing by?" "Not yet. Don't want to overwhelm her." "I'll keep you posted." Returning with 2 cups of coffee, Tom handed one to Mrs. Lei. She accepted it gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm cup. For a few minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, watching their breath form clouds in the cold night air. "You know," Tom began carefully, "there are some really good shelters nearby. Clean, safe places where you could." Mrs. Lei interrupted him gently but firmly. "Officer Chen, you seem like a kind person, but I'm not homeless in the way you think. I have a home, a comfortable one, just 10 blocks from here." She paused, taking a sip of coffee. "But I need to be here, every night." Tom's curiosity piqued, but years of experience had taught him not to push too hard. Instead, he noticed how Mrs. Lei's eyes kept drifting to a specific point in the distance, the children's playground, now empty and silent in the midnight hour. "That playground," she said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. It was his favorite place. Her voice caught slightly on the word his. Tom waited patiently, sensing she might say more. After a long moment, she continued, "My son, he used to bring his own children here. Every Saturday morning, without fail." She pulled out the photograph again, but kept it close to her chest, not sharing it. "When did you last see him?" Tom asked softly, noting how she used the past tense. Mrs. Lei's eyes grew distant. 2 years ago, right here on this bench. He told me he had something important to tell me, but he never got the chance. He just disappeared." Her voice remained steady, but Tom could hear the pain beneath her composed exterior. Tom felt a familiar stirring in his gut, the instinct that had served him well throughout his career. This wasn't just a case of an elderly woman being stubborn or confused. There was more to her story, much more. He glanced at his watch, 1:15 a.m. His shift would end in a few hours, but something told him this was important. Taking out his notepad, he asked, "Mrs. Lai, would you be willing to tell me more about your son?" She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust him. Finally, she spoke, "Officer Chen, what I'm about to tell you, it's complicated and possibly dangerous." Tom straightened up, his training kicking in. He pressed his radio button twice, their coded signal for requesting backup without arousing suspicion. Within minutes, he knew Officer Rodriguez would be quietly making his way to their location. Mrs. Lai didn't seem to notice as she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "My son worked for a company downtown." At least, that's what he told everyone. But the night he disappeared, he was trying to warn me about something big. She pulled out the photograph finally, holding it so Tom could see. It showed a happy family, had a son, his wife, and 2 young children, all smiling at the camera. But what caught Tom's attention was the background. Behind the family, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, was a figure in a dark suit watching them. "I didn't notice it at first," Mrs. Lai said, her finger tracing the mysterious figure. "But after he disappeared, I started looking at all his photos. This person appears in 3 different pictures, taken months apart." Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. He'd heard the soft footsteps of his partner approaching from behind and knew that what had started as a routine welfare check was about to become something much bigger. "Mrs. Li," he said carefully, "I think it's time we called for some help. Would you be willing to come to the station with us, just to talk?" She looked at the playground one last time, then back at Tom. "Will you help me find my son, Officer Chen?" "Yes," he promised, helping her gather her few belongings. "We'll do everything we can. But first, you need to tell us everything you know." As they walked toward the patrol car, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that this cold autumn night would be the beginning of something much larger than any of them could imagine. Mrs. Li's 2-year vigil in the park wasn't just a story of a mother's devotion, it was the first thread in unraveling what might be a very complex and dangerous mystery. The following weeks took on a predictable pattern. Every night, exactly at midnight, Officer Tom Chen would find Mrs. Lai on her bench at Liberty Park. He started bringing 2 thermoses of coffee, one black for himself and one with a hint of ginger for her, just the way she liked it. At first, his fellow officers questioned his dedication to what seemed like a simple case of a stubborn elderly woman. But Tom saw something in Mrs. Li's eyes that spoke of a deeper mystery. Each night, as steam rose from their coffee cups, she would share small pieces of her story. "My son loved rainy days," she mentioned one particularly damp evening as Tom held an umbrella over them both. "He said the rain washed away the city's secrets." She smiled at the memory, but her eyes remained fixed on the playground, now slick with autumn rain. Tom noticed how she always positioned herself to watch that playground, even when the weather turned harsh. He started bringing her simple things, a waterproof blanket, hand warmers, and sometimes a sandwich from the deli around the corner. His partner, Officer Rodriguez, began joining them occasionally, bringing his wife's homemade soup in a thermos. "You know," Rodriguez said one night, "my wife's worried about you, Mrs. Lai. Says you remind her of her own mother." He passed her a container of still warm dumplings. "She made these specially for you." Mrs. Lai accepted the food with graceful thanks, but Tom could see the tears she quickly blinked away. Later that night, she revealed another piece of her puzzle. "My son's children, my grandchildren, they would be in middle school now. I wonder if they still remember how to make dumplings the way I taught them." The other officers at the precinct started taking notice. They'd radio Tom with weather updates during his shifts, making sure he knew when to bring extra blankets or rain gear to the park. The night shift dispatcher, known for her tough exterior, began keeping a special log of any unusual activities around Liberty Park. One particularly cold night, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Tom arrived to find Mrs. Li shivering despite her layers. "Please," he urged, "just for tonight, let me take you somewhere warm." She shook her head firmly. "I can't leave. What if he comes looking for me? What if tonight is the night?" Tom sat down beside her, brushing snow from the bench. "Tell me about the last time you saw him. Not just where, but what happened exactly." Mrs. Lai was quiet for so long that Tom thought she wouldn't answer. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out a small notebook. "I've been writing everything down," she said softly. "Every detail I can remember. Things that seemed unimportant at the time, but now, Her hands trembled as she opened it. 2 days before he disappeared, he changed his routine, started taking different routes to work, kept checking his rearview mirror. She pointed to her neat handwriting. The morning he disappeared, he called me, asked me to meet him here at this bench, said he had something important to tell me about his work, something about files he'd found. Her voice trailed off as a police car slowly cruised past the park. Tom noticed how she tensed until it was gone. That's when he realized she wasn't just waiting in the park, she was hiding in plain sight. The next day, Tom started making quiet inquiries. He discovered that Mrs. Lee's son had worked for a large financial firm downtown. His department had handled sensitive client accounts, including some for prominent political figures. But when Tom tried to access more details, he hit a wall of bureaucratic resistance. He shared his findings with Rodriguez over coffee in their patrol car. "Something's not right," he said. "Every time I try to dig deeper, someone shuts me down." Even mentioned it to Lieutenant Wom, and she got this strange look on her face. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "You know what's weird? I ran Mrs. Lee's address through our system. The house she mentioned, it was sold 2 years ago, right after her son disappeared." Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "She told me she still had a home." "Maybe she does, just not there anymore." Rodriguez pulled out his phone, showing Tom a series of property records. The house was bought by a shell company, same company that owns 3 other properties in the city, all purchased within the same week. That night, Tom brought Mrs. Lee not just coffee, but questions. She listened to what they'd found, had a face giving away nothing. Finally, she spoke. "Officer Chen, do you know why I chose this park? This specific bench?" Tom shook his head. "Look up," she said, pointing to a building across the street. 15th floor. That's where my son worked. Every day for 2 years, I've watched people come and go. I've memorized their patterns, their faces, and sometimes I see men in dark suits watching me right back." Tom felt the weight of her words. This wasn't just about a missing person anymore. Whatever her son had discovered, it was big enough to keep his mother sleeping in a park for 2 years, big enough to make her afraid of seeking help. He made a decision then. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his personal cell phone. "Mrs. Lee, I'm going to give you my number. Not my work number, my personal one. Day or night, if you need help, if you see something that doesn't feel right, you call me." She took the phone number, carefully tucking it into her notebook. "Why are you helping me, Officer Chen?" Tom thought about his own mother, about the lengths she would go to protect him. "Because," he said simply, "some mysteries need to be solved, and some people deserve to have someone in their corner." As he left the park that night, Tom knew he was crossing a line between professional duty and personal involvement. But watching Mrs. Lee's solitary figure on the bench, illuminated by the street lamp's glow, he knew he was making the right choice. Whatever secrets had forced this woman to maintain her lonely vigil, he was now part of her story, and he would see it through to the end. The revelation came on a quiet Tuesday night. The winter had settled in fully, and Tom had just finished setting up a small portable heater near Mrs. Lee's bench, technically against park rules, but his sergeant had looked the other way. The small comfort had finally convinced Mrs. Lee to share her full story. "My son called me that morning," she began, her breath visible in the cold air. His voice was different, scared. "He told me to meet him here at sunset, but he made me promise something strange. He said, 'Mom, if I'm not there by dark, don't go home. Don't go anywhere they'd expect you to go.'" Tom leaned forward, the usual sounds of the night park fading away as he focused on her words. "Did he say who they were?" Mrs. Lee pulled out her notebook, its pages now worn from constant handling. "He worked in the financial analysis department. Numbers were his life. He could spot patterns others missed. That's what got him in trouble." She paused, looking up at the office building across the street. 3 months before he disappeared, he started staying late at work. Said he'd found something in the accounts, something that didn't add up. She showed Tom a page of her notebook filled with dates and times. "He'd call me every night on his way home, tell me he was safe. Then one night, he mentioned offshore accounts, money moving in strange patterns. He said the numbers were too big, too clean, like someone was washing money through the system." Tom felt his police instincts kick in. Did he report it? A bitter smile crossed Mrs. Lee's face. He tried. went to his supervisor first. The next day, that supervisor took an unexpected vacation, never came back. She turned another page in her notebook. Then he noticed the cars following him. Black sedans, different ones every day, but always with tinted windows. The pieces started falling into place in Tom's mind. That's why you chose this bench. You can see both the park entrance and his office from here. Yes, she nodded. The last time I saw him, he was carrying a laptop bag. Said he had proof, real proof of what was happening. But he was nervous, kept looking over his shoulder. Her voice cracked slightly. He hugged me goodbye, said he needed to get something from his office first. Wait here, Mom, he said. I'll be right back. Tom waited silently as she gathered herself. I watched him walk into that building. 10 minutes later, 3 men in suits went in. After an hour, they came out. My son never did. She pulled out the photograph she always carried, the one with her son's family and the mysterious figure in the background. The men who came out of the building that night, one of them was this man in the photo, the one who'd been watching my son for months. Tom studied the photo again with new eyes. Mrs. Lai, why didn't you go to the police back then? I did. Her voice was barely a whisper now. Filed a missing persons report the next day. 2 detectives came to my house, asked questions, said they'd investigate. She closed her notebook carefully. 3 days later, I found my front door unlocked when I came home. Nothing was taken, but every drawer, every cabinet had been searched. And on my kitchen table was a note with just 2 words, "Stay quiet." Tom felt a cold that had nothing to do with the winter night. That's why you've been sleeping in the park. You're not just waiting, you're hiding. Mrs. Lai nodded slowly. Every night I watch that building. Sometimes I see lights on his floor late at night. Sometimes I see the same men in suits coming and going. They know I'm here. They probably think I'm just a grieving mother who lost her mind. And that's exactly what I want them to think. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. My son was smart, Officer Chen. He knew they might come for him. The night before he disappeared, he mailed this to my sister's house in another city. She kept it safe until I could get it. Her hands trembled as she held it out to Tom. I've been waiting for someone I could trust, someone who would look at this and know what to do. Tom took the envelope carefully. What's in it? Account numbers, dates, names, everything my son discovered. She looked him directly in the eyes. But be careful, Officer Chen. The last person who saw this information disappeared. Tom secured the envelope inside his jacket. We'll need to move you somewhere safe now. No more nights in the park. But Mrs. Lai shook her head. Not yet. The moment I disappear from this bench, they'll know something's changed. We need to be smarter than them. She looked back at the office building. My son's still in there somewhere, in the records, in the security footage, in someone's guilty conscience. And I'll stay right here until we find the truth. Tom stood up, his mind already planning next steps. I'm going to make some calls tonight. People I trust. We'll need help with this, but we'll be careful. As he turned to leave, Mrs. Lai caught his arm. Officer Chen, thank you for listening. For believing me when everyone else thought I was crazy. Tom looked at the envelope in his jacket, feeling its weight. Sometimes the craziest-looking decisions are the most sane, he said quietly. You kept your vigil for 2 years, protecting this information, waiting for the right moment. Now let me help you finish what your son started. Walking back to his patrol car, Tom knew that tomorrow would bring a new phase of this story. The quiet nights of coffee and conversation were over. Now began the dangerous work of unraveling whatever truth had cost Mrs. Li's son his freedom or possibly his life. But first, he had a phone call to make to Officer Rodriguez. They would need all the help they could get for what was coming next. Tom sat in his dimly lit living room, staring at the envelope Mrs. Lai had given him. Officer Rodriguez sat across from him, both men nursing cold cups of coffee as they reviewed their findings. The security footage from that night is completely gone, Rodriguez said, scrolling through his tablet. Not just deleted, replaced with loops from different days. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Tom spread out the papers from the envelope across his coffee table. Look at these transaction records. Every Friday, exactly at 4:57 p.m., large sums would move through these accounts. Too precise to be random. The investigation had started quietly. They'd pulled records, asked careful questions, and kept everything off official channels. Lieutenant Wan had given them unofficial permission to dig, but warned them to keep it quiet. Some cases, she'd said, looking over her shoulder, are better solved from the shadows. A knock at Tom's door made both officers freeze. Rodriguez's hand moved instinctively to his hip, but Tom recognized the pattern. 3 quick taps, too slow. He opened the door to find Officer Kelly, the department's computer expert, looking nervous. "You need to see this," she whispered, sliding into the apartment. She pulled out her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. "Remember that building security guard you asked me about? The one who worked the night shift when Mrs. Lee's son disappeared. I found him." The screen showed a small obituary from a newspaper in another state. "Heart attack," they said, 2 days after the disappearance. But look at this. She pulled up another window showing bank records. The day before he died, someone deposited $50,000 into his account. The day after he died, it was all withdrawn. Tom felt his stomach tighten. "Anything on the withdrawal?" Kelly nodded grimly. "Security camera caught this." She played a grainy video showing a man in a suit, the same build as the figure from Mrs. Lee's family photo. "There's more," Rodriguez added, pulling out his own files. "I talked to the janitor who worked that floor. Said he remembered that night because the cleaning crew was sent home early. Building management claimed there was a gas leak, but no emergency services were ever called." Tom walked to his window, looking out at the city lights. "We need to get into that office. Something's still there, files, evidence, something they couldn't move quickly enough." "Already working on it," Kelly said. "The company's having their annual charity gala next week. Every executive and security manager will be there. Building will be running on skeleton crew." Rodriguez shook his head. "It's too risky, if we're caught." "We don't have a choice," Tom interrupted. "Mrs. Leigh's been sitting on that bench for 2 years, waiting for justice. Her son risked everything to expose whatever this is. We owe them both." They spent the next hour planning. Kelly would loot the security cameras. Rodriguez would coordinate with trusted officers to watch the perimeter. Tom would go in, posing as maintenance staff. "What about Mrs. Leigh?" Rodriguez asked. "If something goes wrong." Tom had thought about this. "We'll need to move her temporarily. I know a place, my aunt's old house outside the city. It's been empty since she moved to Florida." The next night, Tom approached Mrs. Lee's bench with mixed feelings. The park had become oddly peaceful to him over the past months, despite the circumstances that brought them there. "We'd found something," he said quietly, sitting beside her. "But what comes next? It could be dangerous. We need you to trust us completely." Mrs. Leigh looked at him with those same clear, determined eyes he'd come to know so well. "Tell me everything." Tom explained their plan, watching her face carefully. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. "The night my son disappeared," she finally said, "I broke my own rule. I went home, just for an hour, to get warmer clothes. When I came back," she paused, her hands clutching her notebook. "I saw them, Officer Chen. 3 men carrying boxes from the building to a black car. If I had stayed, you might have disappeared too." Tom finished gently. She nodded. "Since then, I've watched. Every night. The same cars sometimes park across the street. Men in suits watch me from the lobby. They think I'm harmless, just a grieving mother who lost her mind." "But you've been documenting everything," Tom realized, looking at her notebook with new understanding. "Every car, every face, every pattern." She opened the notebook, revealing pages of detailed notes. "License plate numbers, times, dates. My son taught me that numbers tell stories. These are their stories." Tom studied the pages with growing amazement. Mrs. Leigh hadn't just been waiting. She'd been investigating in her own way, gathering intelligence that could prove invaluable. "We'll need all of this," he said. "But first, we need to get you somewhere safe." Mrs. Leigh closed her notebook firmly. "No, I won't hide. Not now." She looked at the office building, her face set with determination. "They expect to see me here every night. If I disappear now, they'll know something's wrong." Tom started to protest, but she held up her hand. 2 years, Officer Chen. 2 years I've played the role they expected, the harmless old woman who lost her mind with grief. Let me play it a little longer. Let me be your eyes out here. Looking at her calm resolve, Tom realized she was right. Any change in pattern now could alert their targets. Okay, he agreed reluctantly, but we're setting you up with a panic button. Anything feels wrong, you press it, and we'll have officers here in 2 minutes. She agreed, and they spent the next hour going over emergency protocols. As Tom left the park that night, he looked back at Mrs. Lee's silhouette on her bench. She looked as she always did, a quiet, elderly woman keeping her lonely vigil. But now he saw what their targets had missed all along. She was a warrior in her own right, fighting her battle with patience and wisdom that put his own efforts to shame. Back in his car, Tom radioed Rodriguez. She's in. Start the countdown. 1 week until we find out what's behind that office door and what really happened to her son. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While Mrs. Lee kept her nightly vigil at the park, Tom and Rodriguez were following up on the building's maintenance staff when they encountered an old veteran named Pete. He'd been living in his van near the office building for the past 3 years, collecting cans from the dumpsters at night. That night was different, Pete told them, huddled in Tom's patrol car for warmth. Usually, they throw out papers every Friday, but that night, they were burning them. In the middle of summer, the incinerator was running full blast. Tom exchanged looks with Rodriguez. Did you see anyone? Pete nodded slowly, his weathered face serious. 3 men in suits. They weren't regular office people. They moved different, like soldiers trying to look like businessmen. He paused, taking a sip from the coffee Tom had bought him. But here's the thing, one of them dropped something. Didn't see it fall from his pocket. From inside his coat, Pete pulled out a small flash drive. Found it next morning. Never showed nobody 'cause it felt wrong, you know. Like something I wasn't supposed to see. Tom's heart raced as he carefully took the drive. Why are you telling us now? Pete's eyes drifted to the park across the street, where Mrs. Lee sat at her usual spot. Been watching that lady for 2 years. Every night, rain or shine. Reminds me of my mom. She never gave up on me when I came back from overseas, messed up in the head. That kind of love. He shook his head. That lady's looking for someone. Maybe what's on that thing can help her find them. Back at Kelly's apartment, they'd huddled around her laptop as she examined the drive. It's encrypted, she said after several minutes. But look at this, the encryption method is military grade. Whoever did this didn't want anyone accessing these files. Can you crack it? Rodriguez asked. Kelly's fingers flew across the keyboard. Maybe, but we need more computing power and time. That's when Mrs. Lee's notebook proved invaluable. Among her meticulous notes were patterns she'd observed, security guard shift changes, cleaning crew schedules, and most importantly, when certain executives worked late. Look at this, Tom said, pointing to her entries. Every Wednesday, someone comes in at 11 p.m. and stays for exactly 45 minutes. Always parks in the same spot, space 23B. Kelly's eyes lit up. That's tonight. And I've got the security camera feeds ready to loop. They set up surveillance from different points. Rodriguez in his car near the parking garage, Kelly in a coffee shop across the street with her laptop, and Tom positioned where he could watch both Mrs. Lee and the building's entrance. At exactly 11 p.m., a black sedan pulled into space 23B. A man in a suit emerged, carrying a briefcase. Through their earpieces, they heard Kelly whisper, "Cameras are looped. You're invisible now." Tom moved quickly, following the man into the building. Using the maintenance key card they duplicated, he slipped into the stairwell, climbing to the 15th floor. The man was already inside the office, door closed. Through the glass partition, Tom could see him working at a computer. Following their plan, he pressed the button on his radio 3 times, the signal for Kelly to trigger the fire alarm. The sudden blaring sent people rushing from the few occupied offices. As the man in the suit hurried out, leaving his computer running, Tom slipped inside. Kelly had given him a special USB drive that would copy the entire hard drive in minutes. But something caught his eye, a photo on the desk, partially hidden under papers. His heart nearly stopped. It showed a group of men in suits, and among them was Mrs. Lee's son. The photo was dated just 1 month ago. Tom's hands shook as he photographed the picture with his phone. As he inserted Kelly's USB drive, a voice behind him made his blood freeze. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, officer." Tom turned slowly. The guard from the security desk stood in the doorway, but his stance wasn't that of a typical security guard. It was military, just like Pete had described. 2 years we've watched that woman in the park, the guard said, his voice calm. Wondered if she knew anything. Turns out we should have been watching her visitors instead. Tom's mind raced. The alarm was still blaring, but he knew backup was too far away. Her son, he said, playing for time. He's alive, isn't he? The guard's expression didn't change. Some questions are better left unasked, officer, for everyone's safety. That's when they both heard it, footsteps in the hallway. The guard turned slightly, and Tom saw his chance. He lunged forward, tackling the man. They crashed into the desk, sending papers flying. The USB drive clattered to the floor. The footsteps got closer, and suddenly Rodriguez's voice boomed through the hallway. Police, hands where I can see them. The guard froze, then slowly raised his hands. As Rodriguez cuffed him, Tom grabbed the USB drive and the photo. But when he looked at the computer screen, his heart sank. During their struggle, someone had triggered a remote wipe. The screen was blank. Later that night, Mrs. Lai listened calmly as Tom explained what happened. When he showed her the photo of her son, her hands trembled just slightly. He's alive, she whispered. All this time. The flash drive Pete found might tell us where, Tom said. Kelly's working on decrypting it. But Mrs. Lai, he hesitated. These people, they're powerful. Connected. This goes higher than we thought. Mrs. Lee's face showed no fear, only determination. Then we go higher too. My son is alive, Officer Chen. That's all that matters. Now we know we've been watching the right building all along. Tom looked at the office tower looming over them. Somewhere in there were answers about Mrs. Lee's son, about what he'd discovered, about why he'd been taken. The guard's warning echoed in his mind, but looking at Mrs. Lee's hopeful face, he knew there was no turning back. We'll need help, he said finally. Real help. Tomorrow morning, I'm calling the FBI. The FBI arrived quietly, without marked cars or uniforms. Just 2 agents in plain clothes meeting Tom at a small diner 3 towns over. Agent Wilson and Agent Chen, no relation to Tom, listened without interruption as he laid out the evidence. The flash drive, Mrs. Lee's notebooks, the security footage, and the photograph. This goes beyond a missing person case, Agent Wilson said, studying the photo of Mrs. Lee's son. These account numbers match an investigation we've been running for 3 years. International money laundering, but we could never crack the inside source. Agent Chen spread out Mrs. Lee's notebook pages across the table. Your park lady didn't just keep watch, she mapped their entire operation. Security rotations, vehicle patterns, visitor logs. This is better surveillance than some of our field teams. Tom felt a mix of pride and concern. She's still out there every night, refusing to leave that bench. The agents exchanged looks. She needs to, Agent Wilson said quietly. Our intel suggests her son is alive, but in protective custody. Deep cover. The people he exposed, they're still looking for him. And they're watching her, waiting for him to make contact. Tom's coffee grew cold as they explained. Mrs. Lee's son had discovered a massive money laundering operation involving politically connected clients. But instead of just collecting evidence, he'd started secretly moving money back to its rightful owners, small businesses and individuals who'd been defrauded. The night he disappeared, Agent Chen explained, he wasn't taken. We got to him first, but he refused extraction unless we could protect his mother too. But you didn't protect her, Tom said, anger rising in his voice. She's been sleeping on a park bench for 2 years. She refused protection, Agent Wilson countered. Said she needed to be visible, to keep their attention on her and away from her son's family. She's been playing a part all along, the grieving mother, too broken to be a threat. Tom sat back stunned, she knew. All this time? Not everything. For her safety, we couldn't tell her much, but she knew he was alive. That's why she stayed. Every night on that bench, she's been protecting him, drawing their surveillance, keeping them focused on her instead of looking elsewhere. The pieces started falling into place. The way Mrs. Lee always positioned herself to be seen. How she never tried to hide her vigil. She wasn't just waiting. She was running interference, becoming the distraction her son needed. So what changed? Tom asked. Why are you stepping in now? Agent Chen pulled out a laptop. The flash drive your homeless veteran found, it was the missing piece. Once decrypted, it gave us account numbers, contacts, everything we needed. The operation's being rolled up tonight. Multiple countries, simultaneous raids. Mrs. Lee's son? Tom asked. Coming home, Agent Wilson smiled. But we need your help for the final step. There's still a local cell watching her. If she disappears now, they might spook and run. We need one more night of her vigil, but this time we'll be watching too. Tom spent that evening with Mrs. Lee as usual, the weight of knowing the truth almost overwhelming. She sat on her bench, seemingly frail and lost in grief, but he now saw the strength beneath her act. Around the park, invisible to untrained eyes, federal agents waited in position. Cold night, she said softly, her breath visible in the air. Not as cold as some you've seen, Tom replied, their usual exchange feeling different now that he knew its purpose. She smiled slightly. Every night here had a purpose, Officer Chen. Every moment was a gift I could give my son. A mother protects her children however she can. You could have told me, he said quietly. I trusted you from the first night, she replied, but sometimes secrets keep people safe. I knew you'd keep digging if you didn't know the whole truth. That's what made you perfect. You cared enough to keep looking, but you were careful enough not to expose what needed to stay hidden. A black sedan drove slowly past the park. Through his earpiece, Tom heard Agent Wilson's voice. Target vehicle identified. All teams stand by. Mrs. Lee's hand trembled slightly as she clutched her notebook. Inside, Tom knew, were not just surveillance notes, but letters to her son that she'd written every night for 2 years. Messages of love and hope that she'd never been able to send. It's almost over, Tom said gently. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the building where it had all started. 2 years of nights under these stars. Each one a promise kept, a way to say I love you from a distance. Tomorrow will be different. Around them, the trap was about to spring shut on the last pieces of the organization that had threatened her family. But here on this bench, time seemed to stand still, a mother's love made visible in the simple act of waiting, watching, protecting. Thank you, she whispered to Tom, for making my nights less lonely, for being part of my vigil. Tom thought of all the coffee shared, all the quiet conversations, all the times he'd worried about her safety. Thank you, he replied, for teaching me what real strength looks like. Dawn broke over Liberty Park differently that morning. The usual early joggers and dog walkers found the area cordoned off, though few noticed the unmarked vehicles parked strategically around the perimeter. Tom stood near Mrs. Lee's bench, now empty for the first time in 2 years, waiting. The operation had moved swiftly through the night. As Mrs. Lee kept her usual vigil, FBI teams had swept through multiple locations, arresting key members of the organization. The corrupt executives, the hired muscle, the financial middlemen, all were taken into custody without a shot fired. Now came the moment they'd all been waiting for. Mrs. Lee sat in Tom's patrol car, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. He'd never seen her look so nervous, not even during the coldest nights on that bench. What if he's different? She whispered, more to herself than to Tom. 2 years is a long time. Tom watched the park entrance where Agent Wilson had promised the cart would arrive. Love doesn't change, he said simply. You proved that every night for 2 years. The black SUV appeared exactly on schedule, rolling quietly to a stop. Mrs. Lee's hands trembled as the back door opened. A man stepped out, older than in the photos, with gray touching his temples, but with the same gentle eyes as his mother. For a moment, neither moved. Then Mrs. Lee stepped forward, her composure finally breaking. My boy, she said softly in Mandarin, a language Tom had heard her use only when reading from her notebook late at night. My beautiful boy. They met in the middle of the park path, falling into an embrace that spoke of 2 years of separation, of unspoken words, of love that had stretched across distance and danger, but never broken. Tom turned away, giving them privacy, but he could hear Mrs. Lee's soft words. I knew you'd come back. I knew you'd find a way. Her son held her tighter, his own tears falling freely. I saw you, Mom, every night. From the safe house, they had a feed from the security cameras. I watched you sitting here, and it broke my heart. But knowing you were safe, that you understood why I had to disappear, it gave me strength. Tom felt a hand on his shoulder. Officer Rodriguez had arrived, along with several other officers who'd helped protect Mrs. Lee over the years. Even Pete the veteran stood at a respectful distance, his weathered face breaking into a smile at the scene before him. The reunion drew others. The morning shift dispatcher who'd kept special watch over the park. The deli owner who'd made sure Mrs. Lee always had a warm sandwich on cold nights. The local kids who'd brought her flowers, never knowing her full story but sensing she needed their simple kindness. "Your mother was never alone," Tom told her son as the small crowd gathered. "She built a family here, one night at a time." Mrs. Lee's son bowed deeply to them all. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for watching over her when I couldn't." Agent Wilson approached with news. The organization was dismantled. The stolen money was being returned to its rightful owners. Mrs. Lee's son and his family would be moved somewhere safe until the last loose ends were tied up. But this time, his mother would go with them. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Lee walked back to her bench one last time. She ran her hand along the wormwood, touching the spot where she'd sat through seasons of sun and rain, through countless cups of coffee and quiet conversations. "I don't know how to say goodbye to this place," she admitted to Tom. He smiled, understanding completely. "Then don't. This will always be your bench, and will always be your family here." She opened her notebook one last time, tearing out a blank page. On it, she wrote a simple message: "Hope lives here." Folding it carefully, she tucked it into a crack in the bench's wooden slats. "For the next person who needs to believe in miracles," she explained. As the sun rose fully over Liberty Park, Mrs. Lee walked away from her bench for the last time, surrounded by her son and her newfound family. The morning light caught the metal plaque that Officer Rodriguez and the others had secretly installed overnight. Dedicated to the power of a mother's love and to all those who keep watch in the night. Some benches are more than wood and metal, they are monuments to hope. Tom watched them drive away, knowing the park would feel different now. But as he walked past the bench later that night on his patrol, he smiled, seeing fresh flowers laid on the seat. The local kids continuing their tradition of kindness. And if people walking through Liberty Park today look carefully at that bench, they might notice something special. The wood is one smooth from 2 years of faithful waiting. The view perfectly frames both the children's playground and the office building across the street. And tucked into a small crack, weathered but still readable, is a simple note that reminds us all, hope lives here. Sometimes love means keeping watch in the darkness. Sometimes courage wears the disguise of an elderly woman on a park bench. And sometimes, if we're patient enough, if we're brave enough to keep believing, the morning brings back everything we thought we'd lost.